London, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this public lecture as part of the Born Digital Collections Archives and Memory International Conference. Our Professor of Digital Humanities, Jane Winters, will shortly introduce our speaker, but on behalf of the school and university, I'd like to emphasise just how delighted we are to welcome Dorothy Berry as Digital Curator of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and a leading researcher and practitioner in digital cultural heritage and African American history. I'd also like to welcome more than 200 delegates here in person with us in London, as well as over 100 more joining us online from around the world, and the many other people in the room who've joined us this evening just for this lecture. The School of Advanced Study is delighted to support this important conference, and I'd just like to thank some of the other conference supporters, in particular the John Coffin Memorial Trust and the school's own University of London Press for supporting tonight's keynote. I should mention that the press will shortly be launching its own new series on digital cultural heritage, which, like this conference, seeks to bring together cross-sector and cross-disciplinary perspectives on this critical subject. Activities like this conference are integral to the school's mission to promote humanities research, to advocate for the work of humanities researchers at a really important time nationally and globally, and also to facilitate connections between higher education and other sectors. What we aim to do is to give opportunities for humanities researchers and communities to speak with a collective voice, to advocate for the crucial role of the humanities in tackling critical issues of our age. Our approach to the humanities is underpinned by close collaborations with the cultural heritage sector, both across the UK and with partners around the world. In addition to tonight's speaker, I'm delighted to welcome so many other representatives from national and international cultural heritage organisations who are joining us here this evening. You're very warmly welcome here. The challenges at the heart of this conference, how does the Born Digital change what we do and how we do it, are collective and shared ones. As we explore possible futures through this period of intense technological change, our international networks allow us to learn from colleagues and to collaborate with partners around the world. The conference's focus on collectively tackling these challenges is reflected in the school's approach to digital humanities research more broadly. The school, through its Digital Humanities Research Hub, is the home of the UK and Ireland's Digital Humanities Association, which brings together researchers and practitioners to build a collaborative vision for the field. Perhaps no one researcher is more emblematic of the Hub's emphasis on collaboration than its founding director and the chair for tonight's discussion, Professor Jane Winters. Through her exceptional commitment to building collaborative and supportive communities, particularly with colleagues in the cultural heritage sector, she has been at the forefront of Born Digital research in the humanities. Her recent research has included, among many other things, leading major networks and projects connected to internet histories, web archives, and digital cultural heritage. Indeed, she currently serves as the chair of the Digital Preservation Coalition. So I'm delighted to welcome Jane to introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Jo, for that extremely generous introduction. It's my great honour and pleasure this evening to welcome Dorothy Berry as our keynote speaker. Dorothy is an archivist and writer. As Jo mentioned, she is currently the digital curator for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. She has an MA from the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology at Indiana University and a Master's of Library Science from the same institution. In 2020 to 21, she was honoured both with the Library Journal's Movers and Shakers Awards. I can absolutely confirm nobody has ever referred to me as a mover and shaker. And the Society of American Archivists Mark A. Green Emerging Leader Award. She's an executive council member of the Association for Computers and the Humanities, which does such wonderful work, and an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society. Dorothy's work has focused on using digital methods and approaches to enrich understandings of African American history, with a particular interest in archival discovery. She has rather wonderfully described what she does as pushing available tools to bring accuracy and excitement to Black history online. And I think accuracy and excitement could quite nicely bookend everything that we're talking about at this conference, with lots of innovation in between. So like all of you, I'm very much looking forward to hearing Dorothy's reflections on how our present born digital moment can be placed in a much wider, longer and deeper archival context. Dorothy.
I'm not having to adjust the microphone a little bit lower. Really lovely to be with you all tonight. This is, beyond a doubt, the hardest talk I've ever had to write. There are multiple dimensions to the difficulty, some of which I'm sure you can imagine, and others that are more unique to me. Over the past months, working with technologists and private institutions, I have heard my work described as making really big spreadsheets and sorting lists, while at the same time pushing against cultural heritage and preservation and access, being viewed as an interesting puzzle for technologists with potentially exciting licensing possibilities. Non-media and non-commercial end users ranking somewhere below a cat sitting on the keyboard in terms of relevance to project development. I've also never spoken to such a large and wide-ranging group of colleagues. Reading through the list of program organizers and presenters was a whirlwind. I am equally drawn to and intimidated by the intellectual pluralism represented in this space. As someone who often self-references as me, a famous idiot, it is intimidating to sit down and type out anything that feels worthy of the invitation to come across the ocean. And finally, in terms of this being a very difficult composition, I've always been quite vocal that I don't do born digital. I don't say that as a pejorative to those who do, but rather in attempts to be clear about the skills I lack. I work in digital interpretation and discovery, digitizing collections, but that work has been primarily around material objects that have been reconstituted into TIFFs. These types of files are, in a sense, born digital materials because they don't serve solely as surrogates for physical access. If you manipulated the files in a hallowed reading room the same way you do the files downloaded from an archive, you get a very bad name and most likely an invitation to never return. So here I am, a famous idiot who makes big spreadsheets and sorts them. Someone who often has to explain that while my job title is digital curator, I don't do digital curation or data curation, and that officially my government job title is curator, digital. The same way that my colleagues have titles like curator, arts and culture. Keynoting the inaugural Born Digital Archives, Collections, and Memory Conference at the School of Advanced Studies. I hope you will bear with me as this has evolved into less of a talk and more a series of sketches on the digital archives and memory. It is perhaps more personal than expected and definitely more circuitous. With that in mind, I will provide a brief introduction to the speaker that's perhaps a little more, I guess, less employable than the ones I put online before I move to the core of this evening's talk. This is a standpoint from which my reflections come. Moving retrospectively through time, I am the digital curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which we call NAMOC because that is a very long name, in Washington, D.C. in the USA. My work focuses on enhancing the discoverability of digitized archives and museum objects, primarily those related to Black life, through improved search strategies and digital interpretation. My educational background is in 20th and 21st century vocal performance and extended technique, historical ethnomusicology, and library science. I grew up in the house my great-great-great-grandparents built in 1872, about a mile away from where Caroline, my great-great-great-grandmother, was enslaved. My parents met in a Christian commune in the 70s, where there was a large-scale conversion to Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the early 80s, with my dad becoming a priest. My dad grew up in the house his great-great-grandparents built in the 1870s. My mom grew up in a Jewish middle-class family in Brooklyn, New York. Thank you so much for having me. History, memory, and time. I was never a child to be forced to read. I consumed text with the same ferocity that I consumed sweets, and I assure you that implies a deep fervor and commitment. We were always at the library and at the bookstore, and while there were major financial limits to everything in life, my parents saved their money to try and ensure that I never left without a book if I'd found a good one. Recently, thinking of that desire to read, I remembered asking for a Black history book, and my parents gave me a child's Black history book, which I appreciated and thanked them for, but said that I wanted the sort of book that teaches you a lot of history that's very big and thick. I asked them for a book about Jewish history, and they gave me a child's Haggadah, which was nice, but I also wanted to read The Joy of Yiddish, which is a less joyful book than one would think from the title. I am aware that my background and interests are unique to me and also are not necessarily going to have a lot of bonding moments over shared experiences with others. And I think that the work we all do, and I'm saying that in the broadest sense, imagining each of us doing completely different work, the work we all do comes with assumptions about what one knows and what one's interests are when they enter into a classroom, workshop, or conversation. A colleague, Ryan Cordell, associate professor in the School of Information Sciences and Department of English at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, recently posed a question on Blue Sky to the rest of the professoriate. He asked, what is one thing that is common knowledge in your field, but constantly blows the minds of students the first time they hear it? His example was, when teaching the history of technology, he tells students that no one has ever lived in a historical period. Everyone lived their entirety of their lives in the present. His students have to reframe their understanding of history when confronted with the reality that people living in the past did not primarily exist as points on a timeline leading up to the current moment. A woman going about her day in 1825 was as modern and complex and full of interiority as a student in 2025, simply by nature of being alive at the end of time. This inspired me to bring up one of my least favorite calls to action: be on the right side of history. It should be more compelling to be memorialized as being correct than to do what is right in the moment. To be on the right side of history at what point? My response to Cordell's original question was that everything we have in archives, the material record, and to recognize the context of this conference, the immaterial, is a small fraction of all documentation that has ever existed, and an inestimably small fraction of all thought. Depending on collection type, a government archive may have a fairly accurate collection of documents produced by a particular unit, unless, of course, they decided to destroy large amounts of the documents. The personal papers of a graphomaniac may provide a certain type of encyclopedic record of a single individual's actions and perceptions, but they only tell us, again, that single individual's perceptions at a single given moment. Few people go back to make corrections to their own journals when they realize later they were incorrect. There may be an impression of authority in archive, but that perception skews when weighed against our own understanding of what it is to be alive, to be someone who works as a civil servant, making documentation, to be a journaler. I have some close friends with whom I have been in years-long texting conversations, primarily about cats or dogs we have seen, also about my incessant need to ask questions like, what would you do if the next time you saw me, I had a dog's paw instead of a hand, but also I was not commenting on my physical transition? But also occasionally on real-life issues, the sorrow of a parent's passing, the trauma of a friend leaving an abusive relationship. It can be hard to think of a single topic we haven't discussed, from the banal to the divine. One of those friends and I often joke that if future researchers were to find this text thread in a future digital archive, it would be great evidence of the cultural suppression of early 21st century women who, due to oppressive laws and surveillance, did not have the freedom to live as a couple. They were just good friends, they will laugh, noting the very high frequency of messages with ardent affection and admiration in combination with the frequency of messages complaining about the state of heterosexual relationships. The joke here, I should hope, obviously, is not that everyone who studies romantic friendship or queer relationships in the Victorian era is a fantasist, nor is it a joke poking fun at the real and in many locations increasing repressions. The gag here, as it was, is about the internet culture urge to use our concrete knowledge of what it is to be a person who has secrets and heteronormative policing to interpret any text or image of any two people who appear to be of the same gender as secret lovers. With this text thread evidence alone, there would have never been two women who were more lifelong friends / roommates / spinsters who never wed. The idea that an image of a woman, two women from 125 years ago exists primarily as a sigil that points towards what I experience and think now has taken over a popular conception of what archives are for. That the interpretive framework of a person's lived experience is well-founded on a single photo or even 100 photos, or even 100 photos and then 10,000 more, neglects, unfortunately, the reality that if we were to save all of the documents in the world, we couldn't save anyone's spirit. Or perhaps in a less secular mindset, we couldn't save anyone's thoughts. The question I have come back frequently in preparation for this talk, and in the midst of complex professional collaborations and transitions, is the why of this work. Why are we doing it at all? Specifically, the archiving, the preservation, the storing of treasures where dust and bit rot doth corrupt. The we here is carrying a lot of weight. There may be unity in process or end goal, but I'm sure there are multiple paths that have led people to this archival work. A love of history, perhaps, an interest in ethnography, an interest in technology, a love of organization, a desire for order. At the end of each path, however, is an imagined future. So much loss. Data loss. Philosophically speaking, some say that neither the past nor the future really exist. The present is, and everything else is a product of imagination. I tend to think of these stages of time as stories we tell. Those we tell, then those we are planning for others to tell. Working in museums and archives, I have often felt like a storybook character, the dragon hoarding gold simply for the sake of having it, blowing smoke from atop my bounty and ensuring that no one has a chance to take even a single piece without my complete control. When I've asked earnestly, what is the point, say, of having a book that we've decided is too fragile for digitization and too fragile for the reading room and not at all prioritized for conservation? The answer from my colleagues has been that we are protecting those materials until the time comes that they are prioritized and until the time comes that they can be conserved. This answer has never satisfied me personally, Because while I've heard that a good society is one in which people plant trees knowing that they shall never live to feel their shade, I also know that in many societies, those trees may be burnt down in the generation between the planter and the future relaxer. In others, the tree may be allowed to grow, but then fenced off so that only some can enjoy their respite. We must accept the future exists both fingertips and miles away, but the task of preparing evidence of our present for those futures becomes increasingly complicated. I have been stewing over how to best approach these topics with you all since I received the invitation, which means that many people unrelated to my professional spheres have kindly listened to me try to coherently work through born digital archives, collections, and memory. This is how I ended up talking recently to my mother about scrapbooks. When I was a teenager, I used to save my pocket money for two main expenditures: new music and new magazines. I grew up in a rural part of the United States and was insatiable, much like my childhood quest for sweets and books, in my quest for things that were different from what I heard and saw around me. Sometimes after liturgy on Sunday, I would convince my mom that we should take the 40-minute drive into the city so that she could get a copy of the New York Times. She was also not necessarily meant for rural life, though she's grown into it. And I could browse the discount remainder books and my favorite, the magazine stand. I would get standard US fashion magazines occasionally, but would pay the high price for magazines where the price was written out in euros or maybe pounds, whatever else they had. I would read them for a while at home, and then would cut out images that struck me that perhaps represented a full-grown future Dorothy who does not live in rural America, and I would paste them into a big sketch pad. Today, as a proponent of visual appeal and as a cliched millennial, I have a Pinterest board that has art I enjoy, buildings, clothing styles I might want to adapt, an easier and expanded version of the scrapbook. As I said to my mom, however, that old scrapbook is, I believe, still slid behind the bookshelf on the far wall of her office/guest room, formerly known as my bedroom. I still own it, and if I wanted to feel immense embarrassment, I could surely pull it out and flip through it next time I'm back on the farm. The Pinterest, as we all know and many users probably never consider, has never been something I own. Like any social media, it could be shut down, it could start charging a fee I don't want to pay, it could be purchased by some new venture capitalist who has different ideas that don't support me saving an Alice Neal painting I've never seen before to a board called Visual Art I Like. Those losses are amplified by the possibilities that the technological changes represent. The worst case scenario with my scrapbook behind the bookshelf in terms of archival access is that someday, decades in the future, my scrapbook is donated to an archive that doesn't immediately throw it away and instead digitizes it and puts it publicly online. Since I wouldn't agree to putting my teenage dreams on display, in this hypothetical, they found it somewhere or purchased it from someone, my identity is lost to the object. Now it's online, and scholars confabulate on the meaning of the orange leather Mary Janes. What did they represent to the early 2000s rural teenage girl? My Sunday morning memories are not represented in the scrapbook because I didn't need to document something I was experiencing. The worst case with the Pinterest is that which I've already undoubtedly consented to. Not only do I not own the data, but I'm in fact providing a training set on me as a consumer. I am working for the Pinterest board. It's not serving me. Many people in my circles and others jokingly use the phrase, "Look what my algo brought me," or "Why did my algo show me this? What does this say about me?" There is still a lack of context when observing this separated from my person, but not only is it de-individualized, it is actively part of a huge corpus, most of which I am completely unaware of. I have accepted that for me personally, most digital memories are destroyable ephemera. Happily deleting my teenage live journal, even though that means I no longer have, and perhaps no one has, but maybe they do, records of some of the most emotionally heightened times in one's life. As someone who has spent most of their time working specifically with marginalized people's records, I have spent a great deal of time thinking about the balance of the right to control access, the need for representation in the historical record, and the difference between archives, memories, and collection. One of my favorite scholars, Tyra Bynum, does work on Phyllis Wheatley, the American poet, and her community around Providence, Rhode Island. Phyllis Wheatley is the first published poet of the African diaspora in the Americas. And her community had a lot of freed Black people that we know did things together, had lives, sent letters. There are very few of them. Some people we only know of through the mention of other people's letters. What Bynum has said many times that I always find fascinating and is one of the things that sometimes, I won't say shocks as much, but does occasionally scandalize my archive students, is the idea that perhaps she doesn't have any papers because she didn't want you to know about her. Mm-hmm. Maybe her business was private and she's not concerned with you, 21st century person, being able to recount her personal feelings, even if some of the letters do make it seem like her husband was maybe talking to other women. Unclear. It'd be great to have her perspective, but I don't want someone to have my perspective if something like that's happening to me. Memory for the future. This reflection delves more specifically into the ways that memory works when thinking about the digital, but especially when thinking about marginalized people's experiences in the historic record, and in this case specifically, Black people. There have always been regular folks who kept and passed down memories. For as long as we've told stories about ourselves, there have always been those who gathered us together to make sure that we knew who we are. There have always been Black folk in the Americas who valued the meaning of paper. How could you not see the value of paper when outside forces use paper to excuse physical violence? How could you not see the value in preserving paper when a little slip of paper was the only thing that gives you even a sliver of freedom of movement? There have always been Black folk who kept and passed down boxes of photographs, letters, certificates, menus, government records. Just boxes and boxes. There have not always been Black archivists because memories and stories predate archives by millennia. Because the expansive, shape-shifting power of memory has not always wanted archives to make them permanent. What are we accepting and what are we giving up when we equate memory and archives? Formalization and professionalization are tools that can be used to erase the expertise of practitioners. The delineation I'm making is not between trained on the ground archivists and, in my case, American Library Association accredited Masters of Library Science holding ones. I'm rather asking if we let a word have amorphous enough meaning that it can stretch to cover anything, from the 5th generation passed down memory to the British Library. How does that serve to erase the labor of archivists and that of everyone else who sees value in passing on the past? Archival labor is some of the easiest to invisibilize because it exists unseen to the end user. If you visit an archive, you are most likely sat in a reading room. You request folders and boxes from a list of some sort, and eventually they are placed before you with some instructions on handling. The mysteries happen behind the curtain, but in the reading room, you are met with silence and paper. Sometimes you may be led over to a single desktop that you can attempt to look through a digital collection. A lot of times, you might just be handed a laptop as a physical object, because we haven't gotten around to figuring out how to make what's inside of it accessible to you. The road that box or folder or laptop took to be laid before you was paved by many hands, or more likely by few hands doing the work of many. Materials are acquired through purchase or donation. They are appraised for intellectual and cultural value. They are accessioned as permanent parts of a whole. They are given intellectual arrangement. They are given as much description as resources allow. They are boxed, labeled, and shelved. They are requested from the catalog, replaced on the shelf with a slip tracking location, placed on a cart, and delivered up to the reading room. When someone comes to dig into the archive, they don't see this labor. They see themselves watched like a hawk by someone minding the reading room, and a box that could be filled with anything. Archivists have been grumbling at the increasing volume of acquisitions alongside the decreasing staff lines for decades. The elision of labor muddies the waters of their work, but it has also inspired expansive ideas for possibilities of radical change. Black archivists in the United States, by any recent statistic, make up a smaller fraction of the profession than they do of the general public. The majority of people appraising, arranging, and describing Black archival materials have no background, be it lived experience or scholarly, in Black histories and cultures. And I will say that statistically might not align for all other marginalized people, but this is not a unique situation. Well, it is a unique situation, but similar situations happen to others. The goal of all that describing is not to be encyclopedic, but rather to describe things well enough that a person reading a catalog will think there might be something worth seeing in that box. Archivists have been fighting for decades to train ourselves and our colleagues to see things of worth beyond big names of rich men. Black archivists have been crying in the stacks after being told their insights on hypersecuritization are feelings. Black archivists have been editing descriptions to correct inaccurate racist terminology by people they will see at staff meetings later that day. In digital collaboratory context, the old school archivist, excluding political periods of awareness, is often forgotten by other men in our profession when we're viewing digital collections more broadly, if only due to the monumental weight of backlogged materials and incoming collections. We are just as often forgotten by scholars, professors, journalists, and writers who comment on the limitations of the archive, but rarely seek out impressions from the archivists. There have been powerful pieces written about the alienated experience of marginalized researchers in the cold, dry space of a reading room, looking at a document that perhaps traces their entire people's history and feeling surveilled. Now imagine being that same researcher, but working there. The real exclusionary practices that have and continue to keep marginalized people from a seat at the reading room table and a place in the profession are undeniable. Various plans and projects have been designed to address this issue, from reductions in researcher surveillance to residencies with varying levels of success dependent on institutional context, resourcing, and commitment. As people inside the field fight to shift directions, people outside the field have eagerly grabbed on to archive as a mixed symbol, interchangeably referring to the trickled-down economic theories of memory and historical record, as well as to the physical and digital holdings kept hopefully permanent for research and preservation. We know that there are archives in major institutions, but we may also identify our Instagram as my archive. We may have multiple archives on various social media platforms. In my music training, I was taught that great free improvisation is built on the foundations of compositional theory, the idea that you can't break things if you don't know what it is you are breaking. I have sat in rooms where someone lectured on radically reimagining archives for digital accessibility and new futures while describing practices that are currently standard across the field. We just don't have the funding to actually do it. There's often a particular appeal to professionals in hearing someone from outside of their sphere proudly rewrite archives, arguing that there is radicalism in interchanging memory and archive, positing that we can dismantle the imperial, colonial, classification-dependent archive by expanding our definition to include a wide range of receptacles, memories embodied and past imagined. Memory, however, does not function as an acid-free archival folder inside one's mind and body waiting for the right exercise to call forth a particular folder and unveil a specific story stored within. Broadly and traditionally, archives are repositories that attempt to hold fixed material to moments in time. There is always a world of missing contexts, and without that context, the most revealing piece of paper in an archive can be declawed. Primary sources must be pieced together in bulk to begin to tell a story and make an argument. That argument is dependent on the fixed nature of that evidence, although one hopes that the interpretation is at least more plastic. Memory does not function like an archive, but humans have long used metaphors of static technologies to try and understand our minds. Memory is like a wax tablet, a file cabinet, a computer hard drive. These are technologies we have understood at given points of time, helping us to believe that we understand our minds as well. Memories can be reframed, remolded with each recall. They are associative. They are organized not by subject headings, but by complicated mixtures of feelings, relevance, and personal importance. A human memory is infinitely more dynamic than any archive imaginable, but is also more easily destroyed. In the world of digital archives, one of the first acronyms you're taught is that lots of copies keep stuff safe, LOCKS. This concept functions differently in memory than in an archive. When my father was little, his grandpa Jack's friend took him for a walk in the woods. They looked out into a pasture where far off in the distance were some draft ponies. This friend told my dad that those were bears who loved to eat little boys. When my dad got home, he was crying up a storm. And after my grandma Wanda, his mom, tore the proverbial strip off that old man's hide, she painted a mural in the room where my dad and his brother slept of a cowboy whipping a lasso in the air, just about to tie up one of those bears. My dad was comforted knowing that he could sleep easily because the cowboy would take care of any bears that snuck in. I keep a copy of this story in my memory because my dad told it to me once. There are details to my dad's telling that I don't remember. There are other details he might tell differently if I had asked him to repeat it, or if he was alive to hear this, he would probably interrupt and say, "That's not what happened. It wasn't Grandpa Jack's friend. It was a different guy." There are elements that don't make a ton of sense in my retelling. Did this all happen over the course of a day? Did you just have a bunch of paint lying around? Why did my dad not recognize ponies? He grew up on a farm, and his dad wrangled Percherons. But now my dad has passed, and this can never be clarified. I do not have in my memory a copy of my dad's story. I have my own memory of him telling me this story. Now you have a memory of me telling the story, but how are you likely to remember it? Now there is a digital memory of the story in the live stream and perhaps later on the university's YouTube channel. My dad remembered it vividly because it illustrated his mother's love and creativity. I remember his storytelling strongly because it illustrated a woman who I never knew that well and gave me a peek into his childhood. You might remember it as a reference for how this archivist conceptualized memory, or you might just remember that I told a story my father told me to make a point. Collective collaboration. As you know, I have a scrapbook sitting behind the shelf, and now we all have a story about mysteriously ursine ponies. I know how to preserve these things to a certain extent. When I think about the transition to digital documentation of everyday life, even when balanced with the forefronted acceptance of loss I've started with, my ongoing concern is what the combination of a lack of understanding of how to preserve born digital content, alongside a lack of understanding of why one would do that, not even getting into how one would access it, removes one of the most amazing parts to me of personal archives: self-determination. When you process someone's papers, you learn a great deal about them and what they valued. Some pack rats have every receipt, every birthday card. Some more fastidious folks spend their lives culling their material goods, leaving behind highly specific records of self. All of these collections will become steps removed from their original intent through the order and description of the processing archivist, through the facilitated access of the catalog and reading room. But those preservation decisions were also conscious ones. The things that we choose to keep are things that we choose. Though archivists, rightly or wrongly, express chagrin at the diffusion of that word, that the pile of magazines in your closet is your archive, or that a vintage dress is archival, there is something to be said about the collections people create and leave behind for posterity. The appraisal and destruction of our own materials relate directly to what we value, what we think is worth remembering, and what others think we value, and what others think we should be able to remember. As digital output has exponentially increased, see the never-ending text thread, and space concerns decrease, if I run out of data, I can just delete 10 of the 20 pictures I took of a cat that I saw on the sidewalk. The ephemeral nature of spoken communication has taken on a much larger overlap with that of written communication. Photographs not depending on film make me comfortable snapping every single angle of that cat on the sidewalk. Correspondence requiring neither dedicated focus nor the cost of a stamp make me happy sending 2 videos, 3 GIFs, and 5 paragraphs of rambling over the course of 20 minutes. Most people, even most people whose papers become archived, were not particularly concerned with saving material evidence of themselves for posterity. Archivists have long gone to the homes of donors and looked around, discussing what may be valuable to the scholarly public, while the donor pulls out shoeboxes full of paper scraps and old letters. These days, those same archivists are also likely to be given a stack of old laptops, with a casual do what you will, and sometimes the assumption that everything from the laptop will just be printed off and stored with the rest of the paper. While we focus on methodologies for creating archives from digital materials, for educating cultural heritage practitioners who think that they actually might prefer that stack of printouts in how to use digital archives, I have been thinking about how we educate those future donors, planned or incidental, to collect their own digital memories for future archiving. This focus on individuals, on the personal, in digital archiving stems both from my own disposition naturally, but also alongside some work I've been lucky to do alongside a US-based project called Archiving the Black Web, led by my fantastic colleagues Makiba Foster, Burgess Jules, Zakiya Collier, and Meredith Clark. The stated 3 main purposes of Archiving the Black Web are providing web archiving training to a broad range of memory workers, supporting the development of web archiving programs at collecting institutions that document Black life and history, and 3, building, growing, and maintaining the Black Web Community Archive. While many in this room may know the term memory worker as something perhaps aligned with Derrida or other continental philosophers, in this context, the word is used to move towards leveling of the field of who does or does not have a role in preserving history, alongside with a somewhat ill-defined Marxist need to put workers in the mix. Someone might identify as a memory worker because they do not seek academic credentials in archiving, but they do value and believe that their personal collections, whatever they may be, or the collections they work with, are of equal value as something that has been accessioned into an institution, or because they've run a community heritage center for years on their own instinct and creativity, or because they do their work in solidarity with their community. Archiving the Black Web makes clear from the first purpose that a primary goal is to put the power of web archiving in the hands of as many individuals and institutions that want it. Whenever a social media platform fades out of favor or out of existence, there is a mixture of nostalgia for the halcyon days, a general "I'm glad no one will find my early 20s thirst posts." By 30s, you should get past that. And how will we save our most viral threads from users? While scholars may feel somewhat prepared to archive across formats and to make selections of what is or is not a valuable user, individuals often do not know how to do any of that sort of thing beyond perhaps downloading their archive through whatever feature the social media platform makes available as it shuts itself down. The especially multivocal communication nature of social media means that the person's desired save is not even just their own single side, but they want the responses and the shares, the full context of conversation that they were in an inestimably large pile of bound letters. A colleague, Jordana McCagney, once described the web as a sea littered with the shipwrecked hulls of abandoned and broken digital humanities projects. When thinking of personal digital production as future digital archives, I see hulked prison ships, owned by others, accessible by few, and with very limited options for liberation. Dour as that extended allegory is, the great thing about imaginative language is that we always have the possibility to imagine something different. In the US, community archiving workshops have become common across public libraries, inviting the general public to learn a bit about conserving the material things they value, whether in hopes of a future institutional donation, but more likely in hopes that a future grandchild will learn something about their forebears. Archiving the Black Web is presenting one option for expanding that work from the physical to the digital with their pilot web archiving school. With the stated outcome of educating Black memory workers to produce web archive collections, and by supporting Black collecting institutions to formally create sustainable web archiving programs, they are reaching out to individuals and smaller or less funded institutions to educate them on the foundational levels of the what, how, and wow of digitally archiving. The specific focus on Black individuals and institutions works to the particular relationships and leadership of Black people in the creation of digital communities and content in the United States. And the contrast of the importance of that creation with the number of people and expertise in those areas getting academic training and funding to do digital archiving work. I have now, in hopefully not too quick succession, presented you with 5 reflections on history, memory, loss, the future, and collaboration. Some delve more into the personal, others into the structural. All of them, I hope, demonstrate possibility, which I believe is the most important part of any archival endeavor. The possibility to pass on knowledge, the possibility to immortalize a bit of self, the possibility to document the existence of that which is no more. These possibilities should remain available to all of us, and in many ways they can be. Born digital archiving is a public interest field, and its practitioners have the opportunity to contribute to the self-determined digital archive of the future. Thank you. Here are 2 emails. One of them is from my work, and one of them is also work, but not out of work domain. Use them as you.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, for that wonderful, inspiring, thought-provoking keynote, which has covered so many of the things that the conference that we've heard today, set up some discussions for the rest of the conference as well. I'd like to start by asking a couple of questions, but then we'll open it up to the audience. And I'm sure people have got lots of things they would like to talk to you about before then. I was really struck with so much of what you said, but that question of people valuing their digital data and the digital content that we're all creating as we move through life now. And what's in your experience, what works in terms of getting people to think about their social media feeds, their Pinterest boards, whatever it might be, in the same way that they might think about a box of photographs or a scrapbook behind the bookcase? I think with this I've worked with, resilience, which help is a strong word. Because people, even when you keep your physical materials, that's often out of laziness, not out of idleness, prosperity. But I do think there has been strength in really making clear to people how little of their information they own. And I think that resonates because it's true across your social media, but it's true across, if you use Spotify, not only are you not supporting artists, but you're also not owning music. It can go away. And that's the stuff and to be there to anyone. Okay, that might be fine. But you need to know that that's what you're doing. And I think that that sort of recognition of ownership or lack of ownership and possession and lack of possession can bring through to people, especially to people that are heavily committed to their social media. People pride and follower accounts and
I mean, not the person that you're concerned about. They're like, do levels. You don't do that, but then, yes, you don't do something that you don't.
And that kind of context is the same thing that's really difficult to archive. And you might successfully archive the content of a post, but only it's stated in its networks at a point in time. So that question of virality, which I know that the audience are interested in the research on, but if you archive a social media post before it becomes popular, you lose that sense of the impact of it in its various contexts.
Yeah, I think we are all collecting still in various ways of how we want to do that. I've seen to consider media. Even on the sense themselves, more than once someone has asked me if they can use I just formal vacation in a symbolic debt in a hesitation that do it. And I always say, well, it's public, so you can do what you want. But also, it's a quote. We don't how to deal with quotes. I quoted a bunch of people. They said their names. But there's sort of idea that there is another level, and again, going to confusions around ownership, the sort of thing of people having a public social media page and then more set as someone may see it. There's both the structural and logical preservation angle, but that is also complicated by not having clarity on the individual or personal.
No, I think that's a huge problem, and that kind of topic requires integration sense of who your audience is when you're living some of your life online. And I think that connects to the last thing I asked you before I opened up to the audience, which is around the people you mentioned who don't necessarily want that information to be made valuable. Some people, the kind of digital equivalent of someone who wants their all of their things to burned. You're all students after their death because they don't want someone else to see it. And I think that the large number of people who have no conception that this information that they have created and published is sitting in the archives of many of the national memory institutions in the room, in the Wayback Machine, and so on. I wonder if that's something that you've come across in the work that you're doing with communities, the archiving of that web, that people don't realise that this is happening and what their responses are to it.
Yeah, I will say, I don't want to take any more credit than I do or any rest. It really is the work of compensating. I certainly been on strategic planning for some different things, but they've taken a credit for their fantastic work. I mean, on the one hand, I grew up being told that they should put an email to God, basically a front page of the newspaper. And then maybe especially I sort of do anything in the email could be something that's all of this evidence in court. That is clearly not something able to do anything. And I kind of think that the sort of people who truly don't want to have weapons and sort of maybe look at that way, have a problem. And the dear friend who was signing out, another dear friend of ours, they don't want to talk or you have to tell me all that you want to say. It's not work. And he said, "Look, Carlos told me that he got an iPad." I said, "Yes, but I want to read the text for that." Not that Carlos not had a cell phone. He has a landline in the studio. He's in his 50s, he has children, he travels all the time for a musician. You just can't get home. That guy doesn't have a work person, so he's worried about the archive for he's all of that. You can see videos of it. Well, everybody. Which is that degree of separation. And I think that these sort of people that really would want to embarrassing things to be found for, I know, personal politics of decades past are in the same position of most people who were really obnoxious at college in our class. And then everyone in that class does remember who they are. And even if they're different now, they sure were strong back then. In terms of the likelihood of this information coming back. These things are perhaps it eventually resonates to your archive that, especially running the public office or some practice serving in the governments
And everyone, that was there. And the wishes. Probably come back again. And things, and you've got more personal sphere. I remember Joe my face, and we were actually do patients. This is you. That's a wonderful kind of connection back to your distinctions between archives and memory as well. Thank you. I would like to open it up to the audience here. We have roving mics in the room, so if you have a question, if you could open the mics come to you. But any questions more for Dorothy from the audience? Something must watch chance from there to a wonderful lecture. Yes, very good. Thank you.
And what do you think, I have some of the library institutions or lecture what should they need to call into the archive itself with any work?
I think almost always the access to what we should do to help the community. Anything is start by asking representatives of that community. And I think with digital archiving, however, that brings a complication because if you ask someone what do you need for digital archiving, the answer could be I don't need anything. And some will be doing I don't know what that is. So on the one hand, let's start with the ask, because I know with I think like every other when they're really works. Community organizations and cultural heritage, small scale organizations, a lot of them do want to web archive their website, which maybe is a step beyond geocities, but it's one thing they're working with for 20 years. I think also as much education has been provided in ways that suit people, you know, and that again goes back to talking to communities sometimes for, at least in my experience, for library workers, it's easier to do things starting 9 to 5, which is when I work at the library. It's also when everyone else works. So I'm saying I want to do this to help people in their early 20s archive. They probably have school or work or something that seems more exciting to them. Will we ever make that same mistake for them? I don't know, but maybe it really is it's not the best age to think of it. But you can reach specific groups that make things available in certain ways. I think that thinking of the education as well alongside larger questions, not just how do you archive your things on the web, but when I said earlier, you don't own any of these things. I didn't feel like I needed to explain that. That is very baseline knowledge for anyone working with digital things. It's not necessarily very baseline knowledge for anyone who uses the tools. Then you feel a sense of ownership. Of course I own it, you can't access it. Some people get offended or upset when the actual owner of the information does something to change the profiles or change the tools, because that's an invasion. So I think that someone is always figuring, and I think part of what makes that, again, a different type of work is that to say, especially in a national institution, that you need to go to the communities. That's a ton of communities. That's a lot of different people with a lot of different needs and goals. And I think that recognizing that and accepting that in spite of sort of the feeling that digital archiving opens up the possibility of archiving so much more than we ever had seen before. And then that goes down this field and that argument needs to just, but if we don't know what it is, why didn't we save it? We don't have that context. Years ago, I was at a conference, folklore conference, and I won't go to a specific country, so I will say Scandinavian country. From someone from the National Archive was presenting on a really interesting project they had done to archive memes. To archive memes from the Ethiopian migrant community in that country, and undoubtedly in a specific area of that country. I was in the city. And it was really interesting that sort of student interns, they collected at small scale in a more curatorial model, so they could talk with the kids and get actual context and meaning and maybe creators and things like that, to store them not as a complete archive, but as exemplars of a type of material. But even in that context, there were things that students didn't think to tell the people who were doing the project, that the people who were doing the project didn't realize we're missing context. I knew this because they put up one of the memes, and it was like, I don't know, a bunch of people in line somewhere, and it said, how many should people take our time so much that even our Easter is late? And the people presenting on this were like, this is a joke parody because there's a stereotype about lateness, but there's reclaiming us. This is so fun. And I said, well, the joke is that they don't have Easter on the same day. It's usually later. And they were like, I said, yeah, I mean, like, they're Orthodox. It's a different church. This could be a meme for Greece. This could be a meme for Russians. Same thing. But I know that because of my context. And if I'm a student, I'm telling them what this thing means. I'm also a teenager who's getting paid to talk to some people in a library about memes. My life is not my place right now. I'm not talking to everything. Because I don't think to. The same way, I don't need to tell someone, you drink water when you're thirsty. Because I think so, yeah. So I do think sort of doing that slowed down work, which I know is often the least appealing to anyone who funds anything. Figuring out where some communities we want to work with, and marginalized or not, it can just be local communities. It could be the garden section or in a place that's had garden centers forever. And then one day, 10 years ago, when the women set up a Facebook page, it's really intentions around flowers. So I think that's when it starting small and then actually moving beyond the technological possibilities and thinking about what this music group values and what would be valuable saving from them. So.
I'd like a quick follow-up question to that, which is, do you think national institutions are the right place for that to start? What is that role, if there is one?
I think it's tough for national institutions to allow that work because people don't trust national institutions. Anyway, maybe they do. I don't know. I've not lived in spaces. How can I know that I know? Well, I mean, I think that is a difficulty always. And so it's a slow go, but it's a slow go to gain trust in any community that you're not. And community is another word that I'm using a lot, but I don't tend to like because it's too nebulous. And there isn't a community of people that have the same experiences that I have. I have a little brother. He's nothing like them. People are not have the same experiences. But there aren't a bunch of people that know what it's like. Me. And so there are some communities that may have a lot of distrust in the government. And that's something to be thoughtful of. If you were at a national institution and you want to work with a group of marginalized people that are now refugees in the country because of your country in, probably will take a lot more time. And also a lot more fortitude, emotional fortitude. But on the other hand, national institutions still engage in this sort of work, especially with digital archiving needing more skilled expertise, needing more money in many ways. I don't know who will. So I think that that's one of the sticking points, vulnerability required, and also with national institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And having worked with a number of people at national institutions and to knowledge how badly resourced for this work as well. Very similar to doing incredible work and that what you were saying about small, slow research not being the kind of thing it's easy to get support for. I think it will resonate with a lot of people. It's like kind of actually it's what gets funded. Other questions, yes. And could you wait for the microphone? From James.
It's finally first of all. We're in a unique moment in time, Chills, with so many disruptions, some geopolitical, some financial, some technological big disruptions with Gen AI. I'm wondering if from your perspective, you see a shift in the role of artists in this field that we're seeing now. especially in, I would say, in the context of gender. My initial response in my head, which is always wrong, my response, but always, I won't seriously now, I don't know to, is that I don't put my eye on it's too great for me. So I don't think about how GenAI affects archiving. I'm sure it does, partially because I like paper so much, but also because I don't know how GenAI is affecting anything. I mean, I do in some small ways. I know that it's affecting student ability to do critical thinking in classroom contexts in some recent studies. I know that it's affecting the sphere of entrepreneurship and people wanting to sell a lot of different things. But I think in terms of like the vastness of the material created, something that gets forgotten a lot is that one of the most important things about archives is appraisal. And even though there are scholars for everything, and anything that you could say about this isn't worth saying someone's like, this is my entire life. Part of it is also doing like why would I say a particular thing? And what is the particular thing to say? So really the core answer is this probably figured out by people smarter than me in the course of my life, but I will not be involved in that conversation. Like some being so much smarter than me. But I haven't thought of it as something that affects archiving because it's not clear to me yet how much it affects everyday life. And I tend to work at that smaller scale. And I also happen to not be working with struggle. This is taking over all life.
Thank you. Another question from you, Roxana. And then Heather, after that, if we have any questions online, there was any. Okay, excellent.
So for national library, I thought that what Jane said, we're always complaining that we don't have enough researchers, enough staff, enough budget, and so on. But in one of the presentations I went to a bit earlier, there's an image that is sick, so it really stuck in my mind, and it was about the archiving feminist websites in Latin America. And there was an image of web archiving initiatives, which are basically all in the global north. There's nothing in the global south. So there are even the national libraries, national archives don't do that. And even less so when you're thinking about marginalized communities. And another example is a project that last year won one of the Digital Preservation Awards, which was the archive of killed journalists in Mexico. And it's really, since I was one of the judges, I read a lot of details. It's really heartbreaking. But on the other hand, the really, really small team of people who are doing that, I'm saying that, yeah, but if we don't do that, that information is gone, and it's part of our history that's gone, just like the presenters from the presentation earlier on were saying about the feminist websites, that most of them are gone in less than a year, also because of, persecutions in those countries. And so for me, there is also, I don't know, what can we in the global north, because also if I'm looking at the people present here, there are not many people from the global south too. I'm not saying that I don't know if I swear to be. And what can we do to help save someone? Because a lot of that history now is online. All that history is gone for those kind of, even though the entire countries. So for me, there is less of a question of, how should we advise to not say everything, but to something, to not consider that, the whole start of the
21st century only happened in the North. I think through that process, it's a question about to jump to communities because I've been really small, people to learn, people to learn. So if you're, if you know that you have access to some resources, well, that's access spending within yourself the resources of your own experience. My first thought is you should reach out to people doing that work and ask what you can do for that. And that's not really something that you could do when your job hours, But I mean, to me, that's how you help in the scenarios, because also you're coming in with some skill sets, but there's a lot of other things that you don't have because it's different communities and different contexts, and especially when you're thinking about an example that comes to my mind is formerly known as the Texas After Violence Project, but it's they do a lot of work around the digital archive, really built around people's experiences with personal violence, and then state violence, and then work involves a lot of oral history work with people, collecting some of government from a lot of oral history and a lot of consent that to back interviews in a way that if you were to do very strictly archivally, you would say, I don't want the original. I don't want you to be able to look at what you said in a taped way. But in many ethics of folks I know have been doing that sort of work. You say, well, this is not the way I do the work though. I want this person to have control over what's saved, even though, yeah, no, they had said something earlier that I thought was actually super interesting. So I do think that's sort of, if we're really looking at it as that social problem, that is a problem of resource distribution. And there's degrees to which structurally the institutions don't distribute the resources in those space. Well, we have a world for reasons that didn't bad and what they've been. But you as an individual, and all of us did have the ability to do that work to a certain degree. And that to be varies by the individual. But really, it's like, this is amazing work. People are trying to do this, and you know how to do something. So, for me. Yes, I'd like to go, but I do know what happens in Mexico, and we are small communities. I should reach out to, like, for example, the little project with the archive of deaf journalists. It was because they applied for the Demonstration Awards. That's why I found out about it. This is also I think that there's a lot in the media. It's reaching to any of the channels, and I'm still one of the people, because I speak several languages, I'm also trying to follow people from Latin America, but they're also not really active, and the same problem. They used to be more active on Twitter before Twitter went away as we didn't know it. So it's like really difficult to, and then you hear that, yeah, all that was already lost by the time you hear it. So it's, it is really difficult. It's very difficult. And it's something that you want to do. It requires difficult work. It requires the time of getting to know people who maybe don't want to get to know you. And earning confidence. And yes, things are already lost. And maybe they are lost in one format, but maybe they're not lost in another format. Again, I don't know what people are doing on friends. I don't know what people are saying are lost, and no one doesn't bother them. It's complicated sort of work, and it's complicated both when you're thinking about itself, it's complicated when you're thinking of anyone who is constant and distracts you and PhD here in South in Georgia has a really long-term commitment to collecting materials around HIV/AIDS in Black communities. The games that AIDS are still surprisingly common for things in current academic.
completely like college work on a project, how many, and say, so much of our time was spent throwing people through the grocery store and doing errands. Because that is a baseline of gaining some sort of trust, some sort of reciprocity in the relationship. Because as I'm saying, I'm saving these papers, I'm saving these websites because someone needs to know what happened to these people. There's also the part that's like, when I say someone, I don't necessarily mean someone on the other side. I mean someone in the same neighborhood in the future. Or I only want someone to know about it if they're going to do something about it. And with any sort of work that you volunteer, I think it's difficult because we know what we want to volunteer ourselves, what we feel able to. And it's not necessarily what's asked for every day. It's a really important point. I think questions of trust and also I think they will do through the rest of the conference as well. I wanted to think of that you mentioned about people not necessarily counting what's there, wanting to do something, even there is an archivist who think it has value. And I just wondered about that idea of more digital archives as living archives, in that they are susceptible to that kind of change. And for good or ill sometimes, depending on who is involved in that change. But I know from my own research, you might go to a web archive 2 years apart and you'll find relevant information that was not there the last time you looked because different material has been added or something might be taken wrong. I'm just be really interested to hear what you think about the challenges of archives that are shifting around us. I think it's not that different than how there's always been. We'll still have stuff for our thoughts or a folder that was not where it was supposed to be. Or looked into a box or you've done something, it's not there. Or there's a call slip from someone who worked at the library 20 years ago. And it says that it's in their office. It doesn't exist. That's a slower scale of the same thing. But I guess I say that only to just get the troubles of people who know language, but also to think about the ways of what's possible digital archiving has sometimes shifted us away from what is more reasonable to expect from it. Because theoretically, the possibility that you could do every set of that action is really tantalizing. But can you go? And then it's the further should you go? And to me, that is sort of this types of archiving that begins with the question. Or traditional archiving begins with like the purpose of saving. But a lot of the work folks are doing is more about addressing a particular question or need in a different way. And so it's sort of, is it worth documenting those changes over time? We'll have to say that actually is relevant to the overall question of the project. If not, it's just talking to a colleague that you see all the other day who's that's advertised for the PhD student who's looking at strains in the National Archives, which is bits that have become detached from the documentation they should have been associated with. I'm trying to work out how to put those back together again. So absolutely, it's a great familiar. Other questions, Dorothy? Yes, we have one over there and one in front. That would probably things to have.
Yes, I really would love to hear a little bit more about what you think of the difference between archives and memory, specifically considering how our digital experience of loss has potentially changed the relationship between archives and memory. I mean, traditionally, archives are on the side of the record, and the record is not necessarily a memory. So that has been like the basis of the relationship that we have always referred to in thinking about the way they're different. But I wonder what you think about the difference now that, you know, everything is not allegedly accessible and immediately available.
And even if we experience loss when we look for something in a digital environment, there is always something else that we find that eventually is a substitute. Thank you. I think that in the last couple of decades, maybe, in the context in which I've worked, archive as whether human. And I did not know I told you to do that. Suddenly, it's actually down there. But my questions about archive have not been really in focus or thought. I haven't worked in institutional collections. I haven't worked in university collections. Or the universities are that. And so I think that for me, at least, the length of time that digital memory as they were thinking about and that's symbols, that same length of time I have been working in contexts, or thinking in contexts where archives have been placed and hold all sorts of material related to memory have existed. So part of the reason I'm hesitating on this answer is because my favorite point I think is good valid question, but not having the experience in those sorts of institutional or academic contexts. I don't have a particular answer. And I'll do a very rare thing and not try to make up one for you that's say, oh, I just say, I don't know. Which is an extremely important part of all of these conversations. There's so much that we don't know that we're still working through. I just point on question from power and what this has been something very important. It wasn't related to the on accuracy. So we're talking about how to be accurate with the archives and the records we keep. And sometimes we create these living archives that keep constantly changing, and there are multiple chronic with diverse voices. So how do we manage that accuracy? Accuracy is a weird concept, because I guess it goes actually to what? At any point, the best you can do is set something that's accurate to a given point in time. There's nothing more or less, whether it's in an institutional collection accurate, they're accurate in the sense of being the documents that they are. Mostly to see that they purport to be, but even that is stretch. They can go in writing sense, thinking about a lot of different institutional governmental collections that have been displayed at various points by various governments. And it's like, well, what remains is still accurate. That is an accurate collection of material. It's not the full collection. It's purposely not the full collection. It's what burning things are done along with science and ships. But I think that kind of goes to why I don't think of archives as being so strictly read down. Because I think that allows us sometimes to be comfortable in the idea of their accuracy or their foundational regions. And I think that someone's personal papers probably have as much accuracy and permanence as government records. Because at any given point, there are things that everybody knows that you don't put into the official archive, in an institutional and official archive, or you're to go away from the sort of big scales of, brand nefariousness. You're just not good at your job as a civil servant. You didn't file a bunch of papers. What would be more accurate in this human experience than not doing your bureaucratic job? I can't imagine a single thing. But yes, I guess that's kind of my thinking on that. You could be accurate and I can say that. And so in that sense, it's like, yeah, they're living archives, I guess. They're living collections. And when you archive it, they're not alive. Which is maybe a fun, or at least doesn't sound as good. I would keep saying living archive, because I think that sounds more exciting. But yeah, I mean, to actually archive it is to fix it in a certain way. It's a different thing when it's different.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. And before we release you all through to the reception, if you could just join me again in thanking our vulnerable